Good morning, everyone. My name is Craig Ford, and I am an assistant professor in the theology and religious studies discipline here at St. Norbert College. I also have the honor of serving on the planning committee for this, the third celebration of Coming Out Week at St. Norbert College. On behalf of that committee, I want to thank all of you for coming out today in honor of this Coming Out Week, for the very first of 6 teach-ins that we will have throughout the month of October. The theology and religious studies discipline is an especially proud supporter of Coming Out Week and Month of Pride, as we have participated in every celebration since the very first one in 2019, when it was just a week. Now it's a month. I'm grateful to work with such wonderful colleagues, 2 of whom I will introduce in just a moment, for answering the call to help Christians, as well as those who have complicated relationships with Christianity, come to a better understanding of what following the example of Jesus means when we talk about gender identity and sexuality. The famous theologian Anselm of Canterbury famously remarked that theology is faith-seeking understanding. The topic that we seek to understand more about today is entitled, What Does the Bible Say About Homosexuality? To guide us in this conversation are 2 of St. Norbert College's distinguished scholars of the Bible, Dr. Tom Bolin and Dr. Kathleen Gallagher Elkins. Dr. Bolin is professor of theology and religious studies here, where he teaches courses in Hebrew Bible and related ancient cultures. The author of 3 books and numerous essays and articles, his research focuses on the literature of early Judaism, the books of Job and Ecclesiastes, and the history of biblical interpretation. His next book, A Word in Season, Reading the Bible in the 21st Century, will be published by Liturgical Press. Alongside Dr. Bolin is Dr. Gallagher Elkins, who is Associate Professor of Theology and Religious Studies. Her first book, Mary, Mother of Martyrs, How Motherhood Became Self-Sacrifice in Early Christianity, explores the connections between motherhood and martyrdom in the ancient church, in addition to how these ideas inform our conversations about motherhood, families, children, and women's roles today. She does additional research in childhood studies, trauma theory, and the scholarship of teaching and learning. She's also our professor of New Testament. For my part, I have the honor of serving as our host for our conversation today. After giving the floor to Dr. Bolin and Dr. Gallagher Elkins to answer the question, what does the Bible say about homosexuality with respect to the Hebrew Bible first and the New Testament second, I'll open up the conversation for questions. This is being recorded today, so if you have a question, please allow me to run to you with this mic so we can make sure that everyone can hear you. And now, without further ado, I'm happy to turn this conversation over to Dr. Tom Bolin as he answers the question, what does the Hebrew Bible say about homosexuality?
The short but accurate answer to what does the Hebrew Bible say about homosexuality is really not much. But when we think about what certain biblical texts have been made of, and how in the debates about the role of the Bible and what it says or doesn't say about homosexuality, there are a few texts I want to focus in on. But before we do, I want to kind of make some large conceptual kinds of points that will guide us as we look through these texts. So the first thing I think, and we're working at 10,000 feet here. All human biology is culturally mediated, right? All of our, we are animals with biological functions, but we use culture to mediate those biological functions. So we have really strong rules and norms and boundaries around things like when we eat and how to eat and where to eat and how do we use the bathroom and what we do with our dead and what we, and sex and reproduction and childbirth, right? So all human biology is culturally mediated. All cultural norms have their own internal logic, okay? And so when we look at the Bible is a different culture than ours. And when we look at the Bible and we try and look at what the norms are, we are outsiders trying to find the internal logic of these cultural norms, which are not our cultural norms. And finally, rules, specific rules prohibiting or mandating something, have authority based on values that are derived from that internal logic, and that's really a key thing. And so when we look at a rule, when we look at a rule in the Bible, it's not enough just to look at the rule and leave it at that. We have to dig a little deeper and find what's the underlying value. What's the underlying value that the rule rests upon? Okay, and what we find is, in terms of sexuality, The Bible's underlying cultural logic, if you will, and the values are not ours. When we think of sexuality, we could say that we understand sexuality as founded upon values of dignity, agency, and consent. Those are not values that we find that are underlying rules in the Hebrew Bible. Okay, not we're being anachronistic in that regard. So that's really a key thing. So let's look at, there aren't very many things about homosexuality or same-sex relationships in the Hebrew Bible at all. I'll just go to the big one. So Leviticus 18:22, she says, "You shall not lie with a male as with a woman. It is an abomination." Okay, there are two things I kind of want to talk about here. First of all, I want to talk about what it means to say something's an abomination, and then I want to really kind of get at what is this lie with a male as with a woman thing. And we're going to do a little bit of Hebrew grammar until Professor Ford cuts me off. So when we think of an abomination, you think like, wow, that must be really terrible, right? And it's not a word, it's a very biblical word. Nobody uses it in any other kind of way. I've never heard anybody use abomination in their daily conversation, right? And so, when we want to know what a Hebrew word means in the Hebrew Bible, we look at the range of how it's used. And so the Hebrew word for abomination is toevah. And if you look it up, it's like, so what are some other things that God thinks are abominable? Other than a man lying with another man as with a woman, whatever that means. We'll get back in a second. And so here are things. So we know that Egyptians don't eat with Hebrews, for the Egyptians thought that was an abomination. Okay? Deuteronomy, you shall not eat anything that's abhorrent. So there are dietary rules. Hey, biology, values, right? Norms. You see that coming up? Okay? You can't sacrifice anything to Yahweh that an animal that has a defect. Okay, because God doesn't want God doesn't want to eat defective animals. Okay, right? Women can't dress like men, and men can't dress like women. All right? Okay, now look at these are a little longer, bear with me. Look at Deuteronomy 25. You can't carry two kinds of weights in your bag, large and small. That's if you're cheating somebody. So when you're weighing out metal or precious or goods and stuff, you have cheaty weights that this says 2 ounces, but it's really in 1 ounce. So I'm only giving you half of the grain that you're supposed to give. So you can't cheat in business. Okay, you should only have a full and an honest weight, a full and an honest measure. Right? For all who do such things, who act dishonestly, are abhorrent, to'evah, to God. Okay? Okay, and then here in the book of Isaiah, right? So God is saying through the prophet Isaiah to the citizens of Jerusalem, I don't care about your sacrifices. I've had enough of your burnt offerings, right? You come to me every Sunday and you sing the hymns and you put on the fancy clothes and you got the gold chalice and I don't care, right? Your incense, your offerings are an abomination to me, right? Because what does God want instead, right? Make yourselves clean. What does that mean? Cease to do evil, learn to do good, seek justice, rescue the oppressed, defend the orphan, plead for the widow. Okay, so God says, if you worship me, but you don't care for the vulnerable, then your worship is an abomination to me. Everybody with me? Okay. It's a whole bunch of rules in Leviticus 18. So this is if someone has a violent son, etc., right? If you eat upon the mountains, which is sort of worshiping other gods, if you defile your neighbor's wife, if you oppress the poor and the needy, if you don't restore a pledge, someone gives you something in pledge for a loan, okay, you commit an abomination. If you take an advance or interest, you're an abomination. Okay, right? Couple quick ones. Crooked minds are an abomination of the Lord. Arrogant people are an abomination. So a lot of things are abominable to the Lord. And the fact that, the one abominable thing that we seem to talk about a whole lot is Leviticus 18 and Leviticus 20. And that says a lot more about us than it says about God and what God thinks matters. At least the God that we see in the pages of the Hebrew Bible. Everybody with me? Because if we were really going to be serious about wow, we should make sure we don't do abominable things, we'd have to really do a hell of a cleanup job up and down this campus, wouldn't we? Mm-hmm. Right? The arrogant, the dishonest, the accruing of interest. I could go on. Okay? So that's a tricky thing. Let me build on this one more thing, and then I have one other biblical text just quickly to look at. But let's look at this passage. You shall not lie with a male as with a woman is an abomination. The Hebrew here is interesting, and the tricky thing is, what it really says is, a man shall not lie the lying down of a woman with another man. And this weird phrase, with the lying down of a woman, it only occurs here in Leviticus 18 and 20. And there's this I just read this fascinating article, came out last year by a scholar in Helsinki named Joanna Toiranvuori. And she makes a really strong case that the way that line should be interpreted is not that, it's not saying a man and a man shouldn't have sex the way a man has sex with a woman, but the way the Hebrew grammar reads and the way the context of Leviticus reads is that two men should not have sex at the same time with a woman, because all the other rules here in Leviticus have to do with creating offspring of uncertain paternity. Everybody with me? And so in the context of all these other rules, that's one of them. And let me get to this notion of rule real quick, and then we'll move to the last little page of this handout. So a rule is founded upon a value, right? And that's what gives the rule force, you know. So when the easy example is like, can you light candles in the dorm? Okay, why not? You can start a fire. So the value is safety. We want to keep people safe, so we don't want you to light candles in the dorm, right? So safety is a value, because it's higher up, because it's a value, not the rule, it has more moral force. Now, let's say, there's a tornado watch, or there's a tornado, and it's about to touch down, and you're an RA, and you got to make sure everybody's out of the dorm, and there's a power outage, you don't have your phone. Could you go from room to room with a lit candle to check to make sure everybody's safe? But you're not supposed to have candles lit in the dorm. See my point? Right? Sometimes the force, the moral force of a rule sometimes is more powerful than the rule. Sometimes you have to break the rule to uphold the value. Everybody see what I'm getting at? Mm-hmm. So when we look at rules in the Bible, what's the rule? Okay, so the rule is, let's just say if it's either two men shouldn't have sex the way a man has sex with a woman, the underlying rule, or that drives this, appears to be, and we know this from other places in the Bible, that somehow or another, it's not okay for men to act like women. Everybody with me? Because if two men are having sex, one is sort of in the woman's role in one way or another, right? And when we step back and look at that in the larger context of the Hebrew Bible, it comes from a patriarchal culture. Patriarchal cultures value men more than women, and value women specifically for their ability to bear offspring. Okay? That's not a value that we embrace. So when we think about that, we have to look at beyond the rules to the underlying values. Does that make sense? The last quick little thing is, some people like to point to the story of Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis 18 and 19 as a condemnation of male same-sex relationships. I should say the Hebrew Bible has nothing to say about female same-sex relationships at all. Okay? And this is Kathleen, this part. So, but what's interesting is the crime of the men of Sodom, when they come in Genesis 19 and they say, send out these visitors, they say to Lot, we wish, because we want to know them. And know is the biblical euphemism for have sex with them. It's not the fact that these men want to have sex with these male visitors. It's the fact that they want to forcibly have sex with them. It's the fact that they want to violate them. Okay? And what's interesting is if you actually go and look through the rest of the Hebrew Bible about Sodom, and Sodom is this renowned bad city, okay? You'll notice, right, we don't really have this sort of sexual crimes as the problem with Sodom. So here's again just a quick little thing. So in Genesis 13, we're just told the people of Sodom were wicked, because it's kind of vague. God, right before the two angels go to Sodom, he says, how great is the outcry, and how very grave is their sin. I need to see whether they've done together according to the outcry that has come to me. So God is hearing the complaints of people about the people of Sodom, right? Okay? Here, rulers of Sodom, listen to the teaching of our God. Again, Isaiah, right? So what learn to do good, seek justice, rescue the oppressed, defend the orphan, plead for the widow. So Sodom is sort of the model of the bad city, is the city that doesn't protect the vulnerable and the marginalized. Okay? Jeremiah, okay? He's condemning his own fellow prophets in Jerusalem. He says they commit adultery and they lie. Okay? And so they're like Sodom. Okay? In Ezekiel, okay? What's the guilt of Sodom? They had pride, they had excess of food and prosperous ease, but they did not aid the poor and needy. So in Ezekiel, Sodom's an evil city, not because the men had sex with other men, but Sodom's an evil city because they were wealthy and didn't help the poor. We could call that sodomy, couldn't we? Okay? On and on and on. Sodom has a tradition of being a destroyed, sinful city, but its sin is not sexual. Its sin is abuse of the vulnerable, whether it's the poor, whether it's the needy, or, in the case of Genesis 18, whether it's visiting strangers. Okay? In an act of absolute shameless self-promotion, I linked to an article I wrote about Sodom and Gomorrah a long time ago, so you can go and if you have a hard time sleeping, take a peek at that sometime. So in summary, and I'm pretty sure I've run over time, Craig, I'm sorry, but in summary, when we look at the text of the Hebrew Bible, first of all, we're looking at a multiple range of genres of text. We're looking at stories, we're looking at laws, right? We're looking at sort of direct speech. We have to be sensitive to that genre. We have to be sensitive to how we look at a narrative, like, for example, the two angels going to Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis 18 and 19, and how we derive rules, moral force from a story. When we look at just direct laws or moral norms sort of put forward, like in the law codes in Leviticus, we have to be sensitive to what underlying values these laws are expressing and are founded upon, okay? And this is really, really important. And it goes back to the sense that the biblical values in many ways are not our values. And we have to be sensitive and aware to that. And I would argue that especially in terms of sexuality and ideas of relationships founded upon dignity and agency and consent, the Bible really doesn't have anything to say to us in that regard. Thanks.
Well, thanks for being here today. This is always a fun topic to get to talk about. And like Dr. Bolin, my answer to this question, in summary, is very short. And it is, what does the Bible say about homosexuality? Not much, and it's not what you think. There's really not that much, and as we heard already with the Hebrew Bible examples, it isn't necessarily kind of plain and easy to interpret on the face of it. And I actually think it's worth pausing with the framing of our sentence, which we put together, so I'm questioning the question that we're asking. What does the Bible say? And I think that gives a weird kind of agency to a text, as if it says things and we don't interpret it. So being able to say, yeah, okay, the Bible has these written words, but to also emphasize the role of the interpreter in doing that work. So one of my professors in grad school did this hokey thing, and I have heard from Dr. Ford that other Bible professors do this as well. So I'm just going to participate in that sort of cheesy Bible professor genre. The thing that my Bible professor did in grad school is she would start the day by saying, Bible, what do you say about, like in our case, what do you say about homosexuality? And she would wait for this like awkward long time. And of course it turns out the Bible didn't say anything. We waited for it, and it just never happened. And so that's, I think, a silly point, but one to keep in mind, that the Bible doesn't speak, we interpret it. And so to give the Bible, to treat it like it's a magic 8-ball, essentially, like we can just shake it and ask a question and it'll pop up yes or no, that's not what it is, and it's a mistreatment of what the text actually is. And then the other kind of interpretive point that I would raise that's connected to what Dr. Bolin said is just this reminder that the Bible is from a very different time and place than we are. And we know this, like that's not new news, I'm sure, because the Bible has stories about people riding on a donkey or paying with a denarius or addressing a king. Like we know that that's not how we live, and so we know it's from this different time and place. But the Bible also doesn't know words that we know, like gay or lesbian or orientation even, right? Other kind of related concepts that we have. The ancient texts do not have, and ancient cultures do not have. So when we think about this issue of homosexuality, that is actually a foreign concept to the ancient world, and it's worth being able to notice that difference between us and the ancient world. So, okay, I'll answer the question then. What does the Bible say about homosexuality? I'm doing New Testament. Where am I? Okay, so first, it's maybe worth starting with the Gospels, the stories about Jesus, and it is worth emphasizing that Jesus says nothing about it. The Gospels say nothing about this. I don't want to make an argument from silence, but there are 4 Gospels in the Bible. There are other Gospels not in the Bible. Jesus says lots of stuff in all of those texts, and he doesn't say anything about this. So, I mean, as I said, I don't want to make an argument from silence, but maybe we could say there were other more important things on his mind. He says a whole lot of stuff about caring for people who are in poverty and says nothing about questions of human sexuality. But okay, we don't want to linger too long on that and make a big deal of that. Maybe there was stuff he didn't say, I don't know. But let's look at what actually is here. So there are 3 texts, all letters attributed to the Apostle Paul. Most Bible scholars would say not all of them were written by the Apostle Paul, but if we want to talk about that more in the Q&A, we certainly can. So there are 3 texts, 4 texts, 3 texts. And they say different things, but there are some common themes. So in this first one and the second one, the one from 1 Corinthians and the one for 1 Timothy, you can see that there is this list of people. In the first one, wrongdoers. In the second one, people who will not inherit the kingdom of God. So the first one, you can see there are these words that in the New Revised Standard Version get translated as male prostitutes and sodomites. Malakoi is the Greek, and arsenokoitoi is the Greek for the second word. And then that comes up again in 1 Timothy, the sodomites, which is a terrible translation as we're thinking about what is the sin of Sodom. But that's what the New Revised Standard Version gives us. So, okay, both of these texts are sort of stock lists of things that you shouldn't do, and they include all sorts of things, as you can see all of the other things that are listed there, being greedy, being a drunkard, being a robber. And then the other thing here is that these are notoriously difficult to translate. One of these words is only used once in the whole New Testament, and it is not a common word in the first century Greek. The other one is a little more common, but it's not clear in terms of what is being referenced here. I'll say more about that in just a second. The other text is a little bit longer. This one is also the only biblical text that references women. To Dr. Boland's point, the Hebrew Bible only talks about men who maybe are having sex with men. Here, this is again a maybe, but if it is talking about women who have sex with women, it's the only text that does this. So, in this larger section, Paul says a whole bunch of stuff, but I'm going to draw our attention to the bottom. So you see this therefore, and the therefore here is actually really important. The reason is related to idolatry. And then in the middle of that paragraph after the amen, for this reason, again another like building upon the previous part of the argument, God gave them up to degrading passions. Their women exchanged natural intercourse for unnatural. And in the same way, also the men, giving up natural intercourse with women, were consumed with passion for one another. Men committed shameless acts with men and received in their own persons the due penalty for their error. So a couple of things here. One, as I said, this is the only one that seems to reference what we would think of as lesbians, though I do think there's a question about what natural intercourse means. Also, as a little footnote, when Paul talks about natural things, we should sort of be attentive and like it should make our ears prick up a little bit, like, oh wait, what do you mean? Because he also says that women who have short hair are unnatural and men who have long hair are unnatural, which he knows is not, of course, true because I just have a haircut, that's all. Like I'm unnatural according to Paul, but he knows it's not really nature that made my hair like this, it's my hairstylist, right? So, okay, we might have some questions about what Paul means by nature. Also, it's possible, and this relates a little bit to some things that Dr. Boland said, that what he imagines when he says women having unnatural intercourse is actually something like women being the more active partner, women being on top if we're thinking about sexual acts. Like maybe that's the thing, that maybe it's not women with women. But let's say that it is, and let's say that he's talking about women who have sex with women and men who have sex with men. This is all in a larger discussion about Gentiles. So Paul is a Jew. He is a Jew who believes that Jesus is the Jewish Messiah. He is talking to a mixed group of Jews and Gentiles, that is Jews and non-Jews. Because for Paul, like those are the categories that exist in the world. Jews and non-Jews. Me and everybody who's not like me. So when he is sort of discussing what Gentiles are like, non-Jews, he has this stock list of all the things the Gentiles do wrong. So in a previous section, he talks about how they have gods who have like human but also sometimes animal qualities. And then here he has this other example of what sounds to us like homosexuality. But really what Paul is doing is just listing well-known stereotypes about Gentiles. He's saying to his audience, who he thinks will agree with him, oh, you know those Gentiles. They're always worshiping strange gods and having sex with everyone, right? And he expects that the audience will be like, mm-hmm, that's right, they do. And then in the next section, he has some stereotypes about how Jews are. And that is, those are like a little more surprising, and he expects that the audience will be a little like shocked at that. So this isn't really a thing where he's listing things we should or shouldn't do. It's instead just part of a larger argument about why the Gentiles are idolaters. That's the kind of point that he's getting us to. But okay, if we have three texts that seem in the New Testament to say something negative about homosexuality, then we still have some work to do, right? Some interpretive work to do. And I think here is where we would want to think about the ancient context, and that thinking about how ancient people conceived of human sexuality is useful in terms of contextualizing these stories. So a little bit of cultural context that might help is thinking about the practice of pederasty. The practice of pederasty is an adult male who has sex with younger men, like an adolescent boy, maybe even a little bit younger than that. Those young boys could be free or they could be enslaved people, but in neither case is this a relationship that's based on equality and consent and love and attraction and all the things that we think of when we think of why you would have a sexual relationship with someone. This word that's so hard to translate, right? These words appear in 1 Corinthians and 1 Timothy are sometimes translated, you see obviously sodomites, sometimes soft or effeminate. And it's possible that that's the thing that we should be thinking of then, that what Paul or the author here is pointing to is this practice of pederasty, because one of the problems with pederasty, I mean, I would say the problem with pederasty is that's child abuse, right? That's what we would say. But in the ancient world, the problem with pederasty is in fact that you're being made into the position of a woman if you yourself are being penetrated. So when pederasty is condemned in the ancient world, which it is, sometimes it's a common practice on some level, and also it's condemned in certain texts like this one, like other ones that are not Christian texts. The problem is not about sexual orientation, and it's also not about men who have sex with men, right? If you want to separate out act from orientation. The problem I would see is abuse, right? That's the one that we would name, but that's not the problem for ancient people. The problem is that there's too much passion involved, because in the ancient world, an ideal male was a person who was dispassionate, who did not allow himself to get carried away with strong emotions that are positive or negative. He was able to remain self-controlled, and importantly, does not allow himself to be penetrated. Because in antiquity, sex is connected to power, and one of the ways that you exercise that power is through being the penetrator, not the penetrated. So this, to me, is one of those places where I want to pause and say, can we notice how different that is than our own modern assumptions about human sexuality? I hope that it is. I hope that we don't think of penetration as humiliation, but that's what the ancient world imagines, right? The person who is penetrated is also humiliated, and that is the rightful place of women, of enslaved people, and of young boys, because they are like sort of made to take that. That's their natural state. So Paul seems to think, here and elsewhere, that everyone would be better off if they were celibate like he is. That's the standard that he has, in part because then you can be properly dispassionate. You're not carried away with things like sexual desire. And as I said, for me, this is maybe the place where I feel like it's most difficult to think about the distance between the ancient world and our world, because all of this sounds so foreign and maybe also uncomfortable to think about, like that's what Paul imagines when he talks about it in just these handful of places. So when we have conversations about LGBTQ folks and relationships, I don't think we're talking about what he's talking about. We're not talking about coercive sexual relationships. We're not talking about humiliating someone by penetrating them. We're not talking about these problematic power differentials and relationships. So the fact that we're talking about pederasty maybe shows how far we are from the ancient world and from the biblical world, culturally speaking. This thing that we would say so obviously, well, that's child abuse, is in fact a kind of a normal and accepted practice in certain ways, not problematic in the same ways that we would see it as. And of course, the fact that the Bible also has lots of mentions of slavery should remind us of that difference. And this to me is a really helpful part of the history of the interpretation of the Bible, Because in the antebellum South, one of the questions that got asked, just like our question, is what does the Bible say about slavery? Well, it turns out the Bible says lots of things about slavery, and not a lot of them are very clear in saying, no, 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 it's wrong to try to own people. It's immoral to try to buy and sell people. Jesus discusses enslaved people in a really unproblematic way. There are laws discussing how you can buy and sell people and like which are the proper people to buy and sell and how do you go about that. So when people were arguing, no, the Bible says that slavery is fine, they actually had biblical warrant to do so. And the people who were saying, no, 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 the Bible says that slavery is wrong, also had biblical warrant to do so. And so I think that is a kind of a takeaway for me, is that the Bible can be used to say a lot of things. So to me, the thing I want to start with then is human dignity. If we start with human dignity, and from there ask, okay, let me see what these texts tell me. And the other thing I would say is, like, even if we're in a religious context, to approach these texts and ask God to meet me there, and to then wrestle with those texts as God guides me to do that. But starting with human dignity and not necessarily with these biblical texts that have been used to harm people. I mean, I think that that's a thing that's, to me, really illustrative, is that when I learned about these texts in grad school, it was under the heading of clobber texts. Like, these are called clobber texts because they're used to clobber people. So if these texts have been used to harm people in so many ways, then I don't want to just participate in that interpretive tradition, right? I want to start with human dignity. I want to start by seeing the people that these texts have been used to harm, and from there ask, how might we interpret them differently? Thanks.
Two things that really stuck out to me from both presentations was the notions of values and the notion of gender, and how those two concepts really do color how people in the ancient world thought about these texts, right? In the Hebrew Bible, this value of paternity, being able to determine who's the father, right? And bloodline was very important to thinking about relationships around sexual practice. And then in the New Testament, gender, once again, being seen as the gender roles being distinct for how people participate in the sexual act, where being the penetrative partner, sexual act is actually being the humiliated partner, and that is what's seen as the affront. So from values and gender, we can think about the rules, as Dr. Bolin was talking about. What rules do you put into place to maintain those values? And I guess as a third, right, distance. Right? Do we bring different values to that conversation now? And Dr. Gallagher-Elkins mentioned the value of human dignity as a starting point, as opposed to perhaps procreation or having a sure bloodline or maintaining gender roles. So those are just some things that I took away from your two talks. My hope now is that if you have questions or want to begin a conversation about what you've heard or extend it in different directions, that this is your time to do so.
So my question is, and either one of you could answer it, in the context of interpretation and all of the different interpretations that are out there, the different types of Bibles, the different, I've done just a little bit of research. I've been working on this quite a bit lately. What do you think happened that some of these words got so misinterpreted? Was it, in the Puritan era, or, just the patriarchal men, or what, this is the way we want things, so this is how we're going to interpret these words? I guess that's difficult because you have people that are very strict letter of the law, and it's hard to have conversations when that's your mindset. So I'm just looking for maybe some advice on how to move forward on that.
What a great question. Are you on?
I'm going to do this. Sorry.
I think my answer will be short, so I'll let Dr. Bolin get sorted and just give a couple of thoughts off the top of my head. What a great question, because I think that the question itself acknowledges that traditions have changed and that interpretations have changed. So I guess I'll just raise a couple of things, and I feel like there are so many people in the room who probably know as much or more about this as I do, so chime in, other experts that I'm looking around at. So, one thing is that the concept of orientation or of sexuality coming in various forms like homosexuality or heterosexuality is actually a really rather modern invention. As far as I know, I've heard it dated to the 1800s, 19th century. So even something like that, if that concept doesn't exist, Are there still people who exist who, to our mind, would fit under that rubric? Sure, yes. But if that concept doesn't exist, then how do we interpret this in, say, like 500 or 1300? And how does that introduction of a notion of human sexuality being oriented towards certain kinds of people and not others shift how these would then be interpreted? I mean, it seems to me that understanding especially the last several hundred centuries would be really crucial there. Not several hundred centuries, years, and or several centuries.
Yeah, I mean, it's complicated. In my intro class, we pull up 25 different translations of Leviticus 18:22. And the interesting thing is that I think what Dr. Gallagher Elkins and I have been doing here for the last half hour is a literal reading of the text. It's the people who want to say that this is, like there's literally a Bible translation of Leviticus 18:22 that says homosexuality is disgusting. Which, if you submitted that to me as a Hebrew final, you would get 0 credit. Like no, nouns are wrong, the verbs are wrong. And so I think the question is that, I think oftentimes, when we talk about people who read the Bible literally, in that sense, they probably aren't, right? But it's sort of how they understand how one applies the biblical text. I found out today, I was nervously over-preparing, and I found out that when Martin Luther translated Leviticus 18:22, he used the German word essentially outlawing, saying that you can't molest a young boy. That's how so he was thinking the pederasty issue that you were thinking when he translated that. I don't know anything else about how Luther thought about same-sex relationships or anything, but that was just something that I found interesting. At least in my field, we seem to think that the influence of certain forms of Greek philosophy, specifically Aristotle, in sort of making women second class to men in a metaphysical kind of a way and things like that, really influences later Christian thought on how these biblical texts are interpreted. But I think your point is really outstanding, and that is, the kinds of Bible texts the person gravitates to and how they read them says much more about them than it does about the Bible.
One of the things that a person could take away from this is, the Bible says terrible things about women, therefore let's just not worry too much about the Bible. And for those who think that the Bible is something that is foundational, the more helpful comment would be this: how do we interpret the Bible so that we learn the true values that are inherent? And so I think that that's part of the theme of your next book, is how do we interpret the Bible? Am I right? Mm-hmm. And so I guess if you have a question, and does it have something to do with love? So.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think here's the tricky part, and it's not that I've actually sat and written any words on that book in weeks, but nevertheless, I don't think you can. I think it's a problem to look at all of the different values of the Bible and to pick one and say this is the value that is the guiding value of which I use all the other ones. I think we have to have an external value, an external moral Archimedean point, if you will, by which to think about how we guide and use the Bible. And so, Augustine, of course, I think I kind of know where Dean Hockenberry is going. So St. Augustine says, love should be the guiding principle of how we use the Bible. And Augustine actually pulls this out of the Bible. He says, Jesus says the whole Bible can be boiled down to love God and love your neighbor. So Augustine says, if you're interpreting the Bible and you can't get to a place where where you land on loving God and loving your neighbor, then you can't stop. You have to keep he says you turn it over and over in your hands. He uses that. I struggle with this because, as I said, dignity, agency, and consent are not things that we see underscored in the Bible, because those were things that wouldn't have occurred to ancient people. And I do think, Dr. Gallagher Elkins and I were sort of talking like, who's our audience for this? But I would hope the person I hope is listening most to this is the person who's ever felt marginalized because of how someone else read the Bible, is the person who's ever felt judged or hated by God or in peril or anything along those lines. That's the person that I hope to be reaching the most. But I don't know. Just listening to everybody talk, you could argue from a Christian standpoint, if the incarnation Christians believe that God becomes a human being, then what that sort of says is that the dignity of the human person is the foundational starting point for all of our theological interpretations of the Bible. That might be a way out, but I'm not sure.
Sure, I can also add. I really appreciate your question, and I think this is typically where my students end up when I teach women in the Bible, is like by the end, there's so many stories of violence against women, and so many of them are unnamed, and are they even important when they are important in the text, or are they just baby makers? So the thing that I usually try to say towards the end of that course is to talk about the Bible as either a tool or a weapon. And actually, for the people who feel like the Bible has been weaponized against them, I think it is a valid and understandable position to say, no thanks, maybe not. And then for those of us who are people of faith, maybe that feels like, well, I don't want to cede the Bible to the people who read it harmfully. And so to be able to say, like, okay, like a lot of things, if the Bible is both a tool and a weapon, then I want to use it as a tool, and a tool that brings life and flourishing to people. And the way that I try to encourage my students to think of the Bible, and this is to Tom's point about genre, is that the Bible is not just telling us things like do this, don't do this, but it has a lot of different genres. And the way that the philosopher Levinas talks about the Bible is that the Bible is like a space to go walk around in and see what life is like. And when you're there, you can sort of look in the face of another person and see what life is like for them. And so it's an act of empathy, and it's an act of kind of putting yourself in a different situation, as we heard, from a very different time and place. And so I think there can be a lot of value in doing that, while I also still respect the position of someone who says, like, no thanks, that's been used in too harmful a way, I don't want to do it right now.
I was just at a conference this last weekend where there was a similar conversation that happened, I know this is mostly about homosexuality. However, I have a question about kind of how gender kind of plays into, if you can speak to that. I know that, there's the story of like Adam and Eve, but one thing that was brought up was that Cain, who left Eden, found a partner, found a wife, which suggests that there were other people. Yeah, God made Adam and Eve, but there was also potentially other people out there that were created, and we don't know what gender identity or sex that they were as well. So can you maybe speak to your thoughts on gender or sex as it relates to this potentially? It could be with the power dynamics or things like that, but if you wanted to add anything. Thanks.
Great question. I go, okay. I have a lot of thoughts about this, Tanner, and it's a great question. I'll say three things maybe. So one is, depending on which part of Genesis we read, we might have a notion that humans started as male and female, or that humans started in a non-gendered way. So without recreating a whole lecture on Genesis 1 through 3, which is super fun.
Do it.
Okay, it's so fun. There are, in fact, two creation stories at the very beginning of Genesis. They are very different stories. The one, gives us, in the image of God, God creates male and female. Humans come in a kind of binary kind of gender. In the second one, in Genesis 2, the thing that comes first is an earthling. The Hebrew is Adam, but that is really just a play on Adamah, the Hebrew word for earth or ground. So the first creature is not necessarily particularly gendered, and from that, God splits that that Adam creature, Adam, and makes two creatures that then have gender. So at the very beginning of that story, it sure feels like that could be a person who doesn't have a particular gendered identity, or at least not in the binary that we think of. The other thing that I would say about just sort of thinking historically about gender as it relates to the Bible, and this feels like there's a lot of nuance here, so you can nuance the things that I'm going to say in a really plain way. How's that? But there are theories of gender that are different than ours, right? That's a maybe important place to begin. And it seems like in terms of the New Testament text, so Greco-Roman world, that the theory of gender in that period was that there were men and there were defective men, like me. So it's a one-sex model of gender rather than a two-sex model of gender. And so that feels like a relevant place to think about your question too, that if we think we sort of culturally, if we say like, okay, we tend to have a binary sense of gender because there are things like 2 bathrooms for men and women, and culturally we're moving towards something that looks more like a spectrum for gender and not just a binary sense, then it's also important to know that other cultures have had more and less than that, more or less than 2. And in the ancient world, if there's 1 and the standard is men, and then there are people who are biologically female and maybe can behave in manly ways, like they can be really brave, for example, and then texts will say things like, isn't she a manly man? In a good way, like they mean like, oh, look at that, she's like really good. Then that maybe sheds some light on this question of like, even the Bible doesn't seem to assume just Adam and Eve as 2 models for gender. It has even more conversation and complexity there.
Yeah, there's a passage in what's called the Talmud, which is early Jewish commentary on the Bible, where one of the rabbis says that the first person created was androgynous, and then God split that person to make the male and the female. And odds are better than half that that text is probably cribbing off of the famous story that we find in Plato's Republic about how people were once, had 4 legs and 4 arms and were double gendered, and then the gods split us in 2 because they were jealous of us. But you find there is ample evidence from as far back as the 3rd millennium BCE in Sumerian texts, the oldest written language that we know of people who are intersex, people who are non-binary. There are terms for them. They are not. They're certainly understood as anomalous, but they're not outcast. They have special roles, oftentimes in religious services around temples and things like that. There's a class of prophets who are understood as men who became women, is the term that we find in Babylonian texts and things like that. So I mean, there's to assume that simply, we have this binary thing, we've always had the Bible, therefore I read that back into the Bible. I mean, it's understandable, but it's also incorrect.
The word that you made quick reference to, the Greek word there, arsenokoites, right? And you said, well, this is a really rare word, and we didn't really come back to talk about it. I sort of understand why. I'm really convinced, looking at all the textual examples both of you put up there and talking about how fraught the interpretation is and the translations are. It's like very convincing. Arsenokoites is maybe a little bit different, has problems for a different reason, it seems to me. I just quickly looked it up on my phone lexicon, of course, and it does look like something of a hapax legomena in the New Testament, like used once, maybe twice in the epistles, and that's the first time we have it recorded in Greek literature. And then it looks like maybe variations, cognates of that come up in like early church fathers and commentators, and then that's it, right? And so, my question is, what do you take from that? What does that mean? Because it does seem, in some sense, but of course it depends on what our interpretive framework is. Like it does seem like he's grasping for some sort of literal picture of, because it literally means like males going to bed together, essentially, right? He's trying to he's grasping for some label to describe that, but a ready label doesn't really exist. And at the same time, it does seem, given the infrequency of it, like he's not like terribly interested or committed to it either. So I'm just I'm really just interested in saying more about that word. Yeah. Because it seems like a different sort of case, as you sort of noted, from the rest of the linguistic cases.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And it is, as you said, hapax legomena, which is like one of those nerdy Bible scholar words that we love. It's only there, and as you said, does not exist in any Greek before that, and the Greek after that is still pretty scant. Literally, it seems to have something to do, right, we lost our PowerPoint. Okay, arsen, the first part of that word has to do with males, right? So I guess there's a couple of interesting things there. So one is it's in the same phrase with malakoi, which is that word that I said could be translated as soft, and then this arsenokoitoi. So the most convincing argument that I've seen, I think, I don't know, is if we're trying to understand it in its ancient context, that both words are talking about pederasty. One is the active partner and one is the passive partner, right? So if we're thinking about the kind of older and younger members of this, what sounds to me like exploitative and harmful relationship, but is, one that exists in the ancient world. So maybe the thing that's being condemned is both partners, and then in the other text that only has the one word, it's only condemning the one partner in that relationship. So, that's one way that I've seen it explained that to me feels convincing, feels like it makes sense of it. I think what you said, though, about it being a word that is clearly like hard for, it seems like ancient people are trying to label a thing they don't yet have a word for or can't quite describe or something like that. And this is where I love being in theology and religious studies and can, sort of say, sorry, philosopher friends, because I'll appeal to mystery here. Like, in a way, there is an important distance between us and them, and being able to say, we don't really know. So I'm not going to hang a whole lot of interpretive weight on this particular word, because it's clear that it wasn't a big deal, or it wasn't a thing that was talked about a lot, as you said, Dr. Mann. It's not a thing that people spent a lot of ink on. And so being able to sort of distance myself from the weight that gets put on that one particular text in biblical interpretation, that feels like a move that's in line with the kind of hermeneutical things that we were raising, but also one that lets historical people be different than me or something.
Let's imagine that you're someone who is thinking about coming out or thinking about telling someone about your gender identity or sexual orientation, and the Bible feels like this huge barrier between being your authentic self. If you could speak to that person and give them advice as someone who is viewing this text not only as a scholar but as a believer, how would you go about talking to them? And we can let that be maybe our final question.
I suppose I would, in line with what you said, agree that the Bible is a barrier for a lot of things. And to affirm for that person that they are not the first person who has wondered about this or struggled with the Bible, and or who has felt dehumanized by the Bible. That, it turns out, unfortunately, is one of the legacies of the biblical text. And so to be able to acknowledge that reality, to say, yeah, the Bible has been used to do all sorts of harm. And so you're not alone in feeling that kind of negative rebound of those texts. And then to say that I think that those are moments where the church should apologize. And the church should beg forgiveness for the harm that has been done. And so for that person, I hope that the Bible could be other things as well. And I hope that they would find, not just other historical interpretations where we're trying to show like, well, it doesn't necessarily mean the thing you think it means, but to also be able to find life-giving interpretations of the Bible, which I think also exist. And I sort of glibly said to Dean Hockenberry, like, yeah, it's okay to throw it out. But I think it can do other things as well. And I would hope that someone sort of struggling with what the Bible says and struggling with their own sense of being dehumanized in the face of the Bible would also find that there are other texts, there are other interpretations, there are other communities that are affirming and that are trying to participate in that sort of Augustinian tradition of seeing the Bible as a force for love.
One thing my intro students, we go through very carefully in class is that, for the first 15 centuries of Christianity, the overwhelming majority of Christians didn't have access to a Bible. The technology didn't exist where you could hold a Bible in your hands and sit and read it whenever you wanted to and things like that. So the first thing I think is that if this person is trying to live within a kind of Christian context, and I'm assuming they might be if they're talking about the Bible with me, I would say that you have a lot of theological ancestors for whom following Jesus didn't mean bringing a book with you. That's an important thing. I think the other one thing I don't want to be overlooked before we end here is that I think it's important in Dr. Gallagher-Elkin's handout. She says, Jesus doesn't say anything about this, right? So, if being a Christian somehow has something to do with this guy Jesus, right? Then we can sort of sit, we can rank the relative weight of biblical texts, and I think the Gospels come out number one. I think I feel pretty comfortable saying that from a Christian standpoint. And Jesus doesn't say anything about same-sex relationships. However, he does make it very clear that if you don't feed the hungry, clothe the naked, visit those in prison, you burn in hell forever, and so there's no, there are no weird Greek terms in that passage, and so I think that should be a template, and I wouldn't say that so much to that person as to sort of remind the person that that's where the church has failed. And, for a lot of reasons I can't wrap my head around, but that continually just depress the hell out of me, right? We've decided that there's only one kind of abomination in the Hebrew Bible we're going to fixate on, and these other things that Jesus said, well, yeah, they're there, but whatever. I shudder to think how Sunday's gospel was preached in churches across this country, where Jesus says it's easier for a camel to get through an eye of a needle than for a rich person to get into heaven. I shudder to think the kind of hermeneutical calisthenics that were done from pulpits the length and breadth of this country. But that's what so Christianity's hard, and I think natural human flawed sinfulness, and the church is sinful in that regard, decides to take the challenging parts of Christianity and push them outward to people who are not like us. And so it's challenging for them, and because I'm making it challenging for them, I'm off the hook. And but it's decidedly very, very unchristian.
Yeah. Well, can we offer a round of applause for Dr. Gallagher-Elkins and Dr. Bolin? And thank you again. I just have two announcements in closing. One is that Coming Out Week and Month of Pride continues this afternoon with Dean Jennifer Hockenberry's presentation on, I think it's entitled what's your talk title?
It's called Playing with Gendered Identity from the Olympics
yes.
to Church Camp.
Playing with Gendered Identity from the Olympics to Church Camp. I've typed that so many times, I have no idea why I just blanked on it. But that is happening this afternoon. And if you'd like to stop by what I'm just calling the Pride Table that Tanner has assembled there, you can grab a t-shirt, a pin in honor of Coming Out Week and Month of Pride. But thank you all for coming out. I hope you have a good afternoon. And just one more round of applause for our professors today. Thank you. Have a good afternoon, everyone.